The echo in the dark. The space station HFY was a floating city of crime, trade, and shadows. It was a place where anything could be bought. Weapons, stolen artifacts, illegal technology, and even living beings. The station smelled of oil, sweat, and something rotten, as thousands of creatures from across the galaxy moved through its neon-lit corridors. Captain Ethan Cole pulled his jacket tighter and kept his head low. He didn't like places like this, but his ship needed fuel, and his stomach needed food. The only way to get both was to make a quick deal and get out before trouble found him. He had just finished his business when he heard it. A voice. Not a normal voice, not something spoken aloud. It was a whisper inside his head, faint, trembling. "Help me." Ethan froze. The voice was soft, barely more than a breath, but it was clear. He looked around. The busy street was full of aliens, traders, and bounty hunters, but no one seemed to notice. Had he imagined it? "Please, someone, help me." This time, it was stronger. Ethan turned his head, following the sound. His heart pounded as he walked toward the narrow alley behind a junk trader's stall. The deeper he went, the colder the air became. Then he saw her, a small, thin alien girl, curled up on the ground, chains wrapped around her wrists and ankles, glowing with energy to prevent escape. Her silver eyes were wide with fear, her skin a soft blue, covered in dirt. Ethan stared. She looked so young, no more than 10 or 12 in human years. Her clothes were ripped and worn, and she shivered as if she hadn't eaten in days. Most shocking of all, she was staring right at him. "You can hear me." The voice echoed in his mind again. Ethan's breath caught in his throat. His head swam. Telepathy. The girl wasn't speaking. She was reaching into his mind. But if she was speaking telepathically, why wasn't anyone else reacting? He glanced around. People passed the alley, completely ignoring them. Not a single person turned their head or noticed the girl. It was as if she didn't exist. Ethan looked back at her. Silver eyes locked onto his. "You are the only one who hears me," she whispered in his mind. Ethan swallowed hard. His first instinct screamed at him to walk away. This wasn't his problem. People disappeared in places like HFY all the time. No one cared. But something about this girl felt different. He took a cautious step forward. She flinched. Ethan raised his hands. "I won't hurt you." She didn't reply, but her body relaxed, only slightly. "Who are you?" he asked. "Why can only I hear you?" Before she could answer, a deep growl rumbled from the shadows. Ethan turned, and his stomach dropped. A massive reptilian alien stepped out of the darkness, towering over him. His scaly green skin gleamed under the neon lights, and his yellow eyes burned with cruelty. He wore thick battle armor and held a stun rod crackling with energy. This was a slaver. "Step back, human," the reptile hissed. His sharp teeth flashed in a grin. "This one's mine." Ethan's fists clenched. His blood boiled. "You're selling a child," he said, trying to keep his voice calm. The slaver chuckled, amused by Ethan's anger. "Not just any child," he said. "She's rare stock. A Nixian. Last of her kind. Very valuable." Ethan had heard that name before. Nixians were wiped out in the Galactic War. It was said that their kind had special abilities, ones that frightened the most powerful empires. Looking at the girl now, Ethan understood why. Her silver eyes shimmered in the dark, holding a quiet strength. Even in chains, she had not given up. But if he left now, she would be sold to the highest bidder, and that bidder would never let her go. The slaver grabbed the girl by her arm. She let out a silent cry, her voice shaking inside Ethan's mind. "Please." Ethan's heart pounded. His instincts screamed for him to walk away. This wasn't his fight. But his feet didn't move. His father's words echoed in his head, a lesson from long ago. If you hear someone cry for help and you can stop it, you don't walk away, son. Ethan's jaw tightened. He wasn't leaving her. Not now. The slaver smirked, already turning away. That's when Ethan made his choice. Before he could stop himself, his hand shot forward, gripping the slaver's wrist. The reptile froze. His smile disappeared. Slowly, he turned his yellow eyes toward Ethan, pure rage burning inside them. "You don't want to do that, human," the slaver growled. Ethan tightened his grip. His voice was low, steady. "Let her go." For a moment, everything was silent. Then the slaver snarled and swung his stun rod toward Ethan's head. Ethan dodged, barely missing the electric shock. He grabbed a loose metal pipe from the ground and swung it hard, smashing it across the slaver's jaw. The reptile staggered back, hissing in pain. The girl's voice rang in Ethan's head again. "Run." Grabbing her by the hand, Ethan turned and sprinted. Behind him, the slaver roared in fury. The chase had begun, and Ethan had just made a very dangerous enemy. The silent plea. The alarms of HFY blared through the air, a shrill warning that echoed across the station's metal corridors. Red lights flickered overhead, casting long shadows as Ethan sprinted through the grimy, narrow streets. Behind him, the heavy footsteps of the slaver's guards thundered against the steel floor. Faster. The girl's voice rang in his head, urgent and breathless. Ethan didn't need to be told twice. He tightened his grip on the small, trembling hand in his own and kept running. She was so light, her footsteps barely making a sound. But even through the chaos, he could feel her fear. It pressed against his mind like a wave, her unspoken terror filling the space between them. Up ahead, a row of market stalls formed a blockade, run-down traders barking at customers, oblivious to the hunt happening in the streets. Ethan shoved through, knocking over a table stacked with alien fruits. The vendor shouted in anger, but Ethan didn't stop. Behind them, the reptilian guards weren't as fast, but they were stronger. They tore through the market with brute force, tossing aside anything in their way. A shot rang out. Plasma fire. The air next to Ethan's head sizzled as the shot barely missed. His instincts screamed, "Cover, now." He yanked the girl into a side alley, pressing her against the cold metal wall. His chest heaved as he tried to catch his breath. She looked up at him, her silver eyes wide and glowing faintly. Ethan put a finger to his lips. "Stay quiet." She nodded, though her small hands shook. Outside, the guards' heavy boots stomped past the alley entrance. Ethan held his breath. The air was thick with the scent of rust and smoke. Seconds passed, then a minute. Finally, the footsteps faded. Ethan let out a slow exhale. "We're clear," he whispered. The girl didn't respond. She just stared at him, eyes filled with something he couldn't quite understand. Ethan ran a hand through his damp hair. "All right, kid. You mind telling me what the hell I just signed up for?" Still, she said nothing. Ethan frowned. "You were talking a lot before. What happened?" The girl opened her mouth, but no sound came out. Her throat moved as if she were trying, but nothing. I can only speak through thoughts." "Telepathy," her voice echoed in his mind again. Ethan inhaled sharply. He had met telepaths before, but not like this. "I lost my strength," she continued, her mental voice weaker than before. "They suppress it with the chains. The longer I wear them, the harder it is to reach out." Ethan's eyes flickered down to the metal cuffs around her wrists and ankles. The dull blue glow meant one thing: energy restraints. Expensive, high-tech. Designed to keep dangerous prisoners weak. He cursed under his breath. This wasn't just some black market trade. Someone powerful had put those on her. He crouched down, studying the restraints. Any way to take these off? Not without the key. Ethan sighed. Of course not. A deep growl rumbled from nearby. Ethan snapped his head up. The girl flinched, pressing closer against the wall. Across the alley, two hulking figures stepped into the dim light. They weren't the slavers' men. No, these were bounty hunters. Tall, insectoid creatures with razor-sharp mandibles, Their glowing red eyes locked onto Ethan and the girl. "Human," one of them rasped, tilting its head. "Step aside. The child is ours." Ethan's stomach turned to stone. So, it wasn't just the slavers after her. His fingers itched toward his belt, but his gun was back on his ship. Damn it. He glanced at the girl. She was stiff with fear, her silver eyes darting between the two bounty hunters. "You hear me, kid," Ethan murmured, shifting his stance. "When I say run, you run." She nodded. Ethan didn't wait. He grabbed a loose steel rod from the ground and swung hard, smashing it against the first bounty hunter's head. The alien reeled back, screeching in pain. The second one lunged. Ethan barely dodged, rolling to the side as sharp claws tore through the air where he had just stood. "Go!" he barked. The girl sprinted into the darkness. Ethan turned and ran after her, weaving through the maze of alleys, the bounty hunters screeching behind them. HFY slums were a death trap. Twisting pathways, dead ends, towering stacks of rusted metal. Ethan's heart pounded. He needed a way out. Up ahead, a flickering neon sign marked an entrance to an underground passage. He grabbed the girl's hand and pulled her inside. The passage was dark, damp, and smelled of oil. A storage tunnel, mostly abandoned. They ran deep into the corridor, Ethan's breath sharp in his chest. Then, silence. No more footsteps. He exhaled, pressing his back against the cold metal wall. The girl was shaking violently, gripping the edges of her torn clothing. Ethan crouched beside her. "You okay?" She nodded but wouldn't meet his eyes. Ethan hesitated, then sighed. "Look, kid, what's your name?" She finally looked up at him. "Selah." Her voice in his mind was barely above a whisper now. Ethan leaned his head back against the wall. "All right, Selah. I'm Ethan. Looks like we're stuck together for now." Her gaze softened slightly, but she still looked afraid. Ethan glanced down at the glowing cuffs again. His jaw tightened. He needed to get those off her. And to do that, they had to get off HFY. The problem? Now, every bounty hunter and slaver on the station would be looking for them, and Ethan had no idea why. But he was going to find out. No matter what it took. A desperate gamble. The air inside the underground tunnel was damp, thick with the scent of rust and old machinery. Faint droplets of water dripped from overhead pipes, creating an eerie rhythm against the silence. Ethan pressed his back against the cold metal wall, his breath coming in slow, controlled inhales. Across from him, Selah sat curled up, her silver eyes barely visible in the dim light. She was exhausted. The glowing restraints on her wrists and ankles sapped her energy, leaving her too weak to even lift her head. Ethan clenched his fists. They couldn't stay here. The entire station was crawling with bounty hunters and slavers searching for them. The only way out was his ship, the Odyssey, docked at the far end of the station in the secured hangars. But there was one major problem. Ethan had lost access to it. The impossible situation. HFY was a lawless station, but even criminals followed some rules. The docking bay required clearance codes to access ships, and Ethan's were revoked the moment the slavers' men reported him as a fugitive. If he wanted to escape, he needed to get those codes back. And the only way to do that? A gamble. Ethan's eyes flickered toward Selah. She was shivering. Even in her weakened state, she must have felt his frustration, because she lifted her head slightly. We have to move soon," her voice whispered in his mind, weak but steady. "I know, kid," Ethan muttered. "I have a plan. You're not gonna like it." Selah didn't argue. She was too tired to protest. Ethan sighed. There was only one place on the station where he could earn enough credits to buy back his ship clearance. The Blood Pit, a brutal underground fighting ring where criminals bet on life-or-death brawls. Ethan had sworn never to step inside again. But now, he didn't have a choice. The Blood Pit. Ethan stood at the entrance of the arena, his pulse steady but his nerves sharp. The massive steel doors in front of him slammed open, revealing a cavernous space filled with drunken gamblers, roaring crowds, and neon betting screens flashing odds in alien languages. The stench of sweat and blood hung in the air. At the center of it all, a caged fighting pit, where two warriors tore into each other, fists colliding with sickening force. A bell rang. One fighter collapsed, his body limp. The crowd erupted in cheers. Ethan swallowed hard. He hated this place, but right now it was his only way out. He made his way through the crowd until he spotted his target, a heavy-set alien with 4 arms and a face like a bulldog sitting on a raised platform. Rocco, the fight organizer. Rocco noticed Ethan instantly and grinned, his sharp teeth flashing. "Cole, thought you were done with us." "Eh?" Ethan forced a smile. "Yeah, well, turns out I need money fast." Rocco chuckled. "I'm guessing you want to fight." "One match, high stakes." Rocco raised an eyebrow. "You sure? We got some real monsters tonight." Ethan glanced at Selah, who sat in the shadows, hidden from view. "I'm sure." Rocco studied him for a moment, then grinned. "All right, Cole. One fight. You win, you get paid. You lose." He let the words hang in the air, laughing darkly. Ethan's jaw tightened. Losing wasn't an option. The fight for freedom. The steel cage slammed shut behind him, locking Ethan inside the pit. The roar of the crowd vibrated through his bones. His opponent stepped forward. Ethan's stomach dropped. It wasn't just a fighter. It was a Vornax beast, a towering 8-foot-tall creature with armored skin, 4 muscular arms, and a mouth full of serrated fangs. The crowd went wild. "Dead man walking," someone shouted. Ethan clenched his fists. He had fought before, but never against something like this. The bell rang. The Vornax lunged, swinging one massive arm. Ethan dove aside, barely missing the strike. The air rushed past his face, the sheer force enough to crack bone if it landed. He needed a plan. Fast. The beast was strong but slow. If Ethan could keep moving, he had a chance. The Vornax swung again, this time catching Ethan's shoulder. Pain exploded down his arm, but he forced himself to keep standing. He couldn't let it end here. Not when Selah's life depended on it. Not when they were so close to escaping. The beast charged again, but this time, Ethan was ready. He ducked under its swing and delivered a brutal punch to its throat, the only weak spot on a Vornax. The beast staggered, choking. Ethan didn't hesitate. He grabbed a loose metal rod from the ground and drove it into the beast's side with everything he had. The Vornax let out a piercing shriek, then collapsed. Silence fell over the crowd. Then, an explosion of cheers. Ethan's chest heaved as the announcer declared him the winner. The escape plan. Rocco met Ethan outside the cage, shaking his head in disbelief. "Didn't think you had it in you, Cole." Ethan ignored him. "Give me my credits. I need my ship clearance reinstated." Rocco smirked. "You earned it." He handed Ethan a small data chip, his ticket to get back to the Odyssey. Ethan grabbed it, then turned back to Selah. She looked at him in awe, her silver eyes shimmering in the dim light. You won," her voice whispered in his mind. Ethan offered a small grin, despite his aching ribs. "Told you I had a plan." But they weren't safe yet. They still had to reach his ship and escape the station alive. And Ethan had a feeling the real fight was only just beginning. The chase through the stars. The dim glow of Zephyr 9's artificial lights flickered overhead as Ethan and Selah hurried through the lower docking levels, their footsteps muffled by the hum of massive engines warming up in the distance. The air was thick with the scent of burned fuel and ozone, and the low rumble of departing ships vibrated through the metal floor. Ethan tightened his grip on the stolen clearance chip as he navigated the maze of corridors. Every step felt like a countdown to disaster. They were so close. The Odyssey was just beyond the security checkpoint, but Ethan knew better than to assume they were safe. Selah, still weak from the restraints, walked beside him in silence, her silver eyes darting nervously toward every passing shadow. Though she didn't speak, Ethan could feel her emotions pressing against his mind. Fear, exhaustion, and something deeper. A warning. "They're coming," her voice whispered inside his head. Ethan's stomach dropped. He heard it a second later, the distant metallic clang of boots against steel, moving fast. The bounty hunters had found them. "Run." Ethan grabbed Selah's hand, and they bolted through the corridors. Behind them, voices shouted orders, and the distinct hum of plasma rifles charging sent adrenaline flooding through Ethan's system. A race against time. The docking bay entrance loomed ahead, a massive security checkpoint lined with guards and biometric scanners. A reinforced barrier separated the lower levels from the launch platforms, where ships were docked. A long line of travelers queued up for inspection, oblivious to the chaos about to unfold. Ethan skidded to a stop, scanning for an opening. They didn't have time to wait. There. Selah's voice rang in his mind, sharper this time. She pointed toward a maintenance tunnel running parallel to the main entrance. No guards, no scanners, just one locked door. Ethan cursed under his breath. Figures. The footsteps behind them grew louder. They had seconds before the bounty hunters reached them. Ethan pulled out his hacking device, a small handheld module with a glowing interface. He pressed it against the lock and watched as the display flashed red. Access denied. Come on, Ethan growled, frantically inputting a bypass sequence. Selah tensed beside him, her breathing rapid. They're too close. Ethan heard the gunfire before he saw it. Blue plasma bolts slammed into the walls around them, sizzling on impact. One shot narrowly missed Selah's shoulder. Without thinking, Ethan pulled her behind him, shielding her with his body as he slammed the hacking module against the lock one last time. A sharp beep. The door slid open. Move. Ethan shoved Selah through first, then followed, slamming the door shut behind them, just as another volley of plasma fire erupted from the corridor. A muffled explosion rocked the door from the other side, but the reinforced metal held. For now. Inside the tunnels. The maintenance tunnel was dark, stretching into the depths of the station like the throat of some giant beast. A single flickering light strip ran along the ceiling, casting eerie shadows across the walls. Selah clutched her arms, still trembling from the near miss. Ethan took a steadying breath. You okay? She nodded, though she looked far from okay. Ethan checked his wrist display. We don't have much time. The tunnel leads directly to the lower docks. Once we reach the Odyssey, we're gone. Selah hesitated before speaking. They won't stop chasing us, will they? Ethan glanced at her, his jaw tightening. No, not until they get what they want. Selah swallowed hard. Ethan crouched beside her. Listen, kid. I don't know why you're so important to these people, but I'm not letting them take you. You understand? Her eyes searched his face, as if trying to believe him. Finally, she nodded. Ethan offered a small smirk. Good. Now let's get out of here. The final stretch. They reached the end of the tunnel in record time. Ethan carefully pried open a side panel, revealing a clear view of the launch bay. There she was, the Odyssey. A sleek, well-worn freighter with reinforced plating, parked at the far end of the hangar. The docking clamps were still locked in place, but once they were on board, Ethan could override them manually. Selah exhaled softly, relief washing over her face. But Ethan felt something was wrong. The docking bay was too quiet. No security personnel, no traders, no cargo crews. Ethan's pulse spiked. This wasn't a lucky break. This was a trap. A low, mechanical hum filled the air. From the shadows near the Odyssey, a massive warship decloaked. Ethan's blood ran cold. The Crith Dominion. A towering black and red warship, its hull lined with energy turrets and plasma cannons, hovered just above the docking bay. The Cryth were one of the most feared empires in the galaxy, and if they were here, it meant Selah was worth far more than Ethan ever imagined. As if on cue, the ship's side hatch opened, revealing a figure cloaked in dark armor, his glowing yellow eyes locking onto Selah. "Bring the girl," the Cryth commander ordered. From behind the warship, a squad of armored soldiers emerged, weapons raised. Ethan's mind raced. They were outgunned, outnumbered. But there was one thing Ethan knew about bounty hunters and soldiers. They expected compliance. He was about to give them the exact opposite. He leaned close to Selah. "When I say run, you get to the ship and don't stop. No matter what." "Got it." Selah swallowed, her silver eyes flickering with fear, but she nodded. Ethan turned back to the Cryth commander, raising his hands in surrender. All right," Ethan called out. "No need for guns. Let's talk." The commander smirked. "Wise choice, human." Ethan grinned back. Then, with a single sharp movement, he yanked a flash grenade from his belt and hurled it to the ground. A blinding white light exploded across the hangar. The soldiers reeled back, momentarily blinded. "Run," Ethan roared. Selah sprinted for the Odyssey. Ethan dove behind a stack of crates, narrowly dodging a burst of plasma fire. He had seconds, maybe less, before the Cryth recovered. If he didn't get to the ship now, neither of them would be leaving the station alive. The truth about Selah. The moment the flash grenade erupted in a blinding white explosion, Ethan bolted from cover, his heart pounding as plasma fire scorched the air behind him. The entire docking bay lit up in chaos. The Cryth soldiers staggered backward, momentarily blinded, while alarms blared through the station. But Ethan didn't stop to admire his handiwork. He had seconds before they recovered. Selah was already sprinting toward the Odyssey, her small form barely a blur against the metallic floor. She was fast, but not fast enough. Ethan saw the glint of a plasma rifle being raised behind her. A soldier had recovered faster than expected. No time to think. Ethan threw himself forward, grabbing a discarded metal panel and hurling it like a shield just as the shot fired. The plasma bolt ricocheted off the metal, narrowly missing Selah's back. "Keep running," Ethan shouted, his voice hoarse. Selah didn't hesitate. She leaped onto the boarding ramp, vanishing inside the Odyssey. Ethan wasn't far behind. He vaulted up the ramp, slamming his palm against the emergency override panel. The ship's external shields powered up, and the docking ramp sealed shut just as Cryth soldiers reached the base of the ship. A deep rumble shook the floor as the Odyssey's engines roared to life. Ethan stumbled into the cockpit, breathless. Selah stood just behind him, her silver eyes wide with terror. Outside, the Cryth warship hovered menacingly, its weapons charging. "Strap in, kid," Ethan growled as he slid into the pilot's chair. "This is gonna get messy." Breaking through the blockade, the Odyssey shook violently as enemy ships fired on them, blue plasma bolts slamming into the ship's outer shielding. Ethan gritted his teeth, yanking the controls. The ship lurched to the left, narrowly dodging a missile lock. Come on," Ethan muttered, flipping a series of switches. The thrusters kicked into overdrive, and the ship shot forward like a bullet. But the Cryth warship moved fast, cutting off their exit. A deep metallic voice crackled over the comms. "You cannot run, human. Surrender the girl." Ethan scoffed, twisting the controls. "Yeah, you'll have to catch me first." He barrel-rolled the Odyssey just as a cluster of enemy drones swarmed in, weaving through the chaos of the docking bay. Selah gasped, gripping the seat beside her. "They're going to trap us." Ethan's mind raced. The main exit was blocked. They'd never get past the Cryth warship head-on. But there was another way. He flicked open a station blueprint on the holoscreen. There, a maintenance shaft just beneath the hangar, leading straight into open space. It was too narrow for a warship, but the Odyssey could squeeze through. "Hang on," Ethan warned. He pitched the ship downward, diving toward the lower levels of the station. The Crith soldiers realized too late. By the time they redirected their fire, the Odyssey was already slipping into the maintenance shaft, its engines screaming from the tight maneuvering. The tunnel was pitch dark, with barely enough room to move. Ethan's pulse pounded as he tilted the ship at just the right angles, avoiding massive steel beams and exposed wiring. The Odyssey scraped against the walls, sparks flying. Almost there. A final turn. And then, open space. The moment they burst free from the tunnel, Ethan slammed the hyperdrive control. The stars outside blurred into streaks of white light. The Odyssey was gone. The truth unveiled. The ship drifted silently through hyperspace, the blue glow of the jump stream casting eerie shadows inside the cockpit. For the first time since escaping HFY, there was no immediate danger. Ethan finally allowed himself to breathe. He turned to Selah. "All right, kid," he said, exhaling. "Time for some answers." Selah fidgeted, her fingers tracing the edges of her glowing restraints. Her silver eyes flickered in the dim light. You saved me," her voice echoed in his mind. Ethan leaned back. "Yeah, well, you looked like you needed a hand." Selah hesitated before finally meeting his gaze. "I am not just an orphan, Ethan." A pause. "I am the last of the Nixian royal bloodline." Ethan's stomach dropped. He had suspected she was important, but not this important. Nixians weren't just rare. They were once one of the most powerful telepathic races in the galaxy, until the Crith Dominion wiped them out. And if Selah was telling the truth, then she wasn't just any survivor. She was the last heir to a destroyed empire. Ethan rubbed his temples. "And let me guess, the Crith want to make sure you never get a chance to reclaim your throne." Selah nodded. "They want to extract my abilities. If they succeed, they can use my telepathic power as a weapon." Ethan swore under his breath. Now it made sense why the Crith had pulled out all the stops. This wasn't just about one orphan girl. It was about power, control, the future of the galaxy. And Ethan had just put himself right in the middle of it. He sighed. "You know, kid, I was just supposed to refuel my ship and leave that station." Selah gave him a small, tired smile. "You should have ignored me." Ethan smirked. "Yeah, well, I've never been good at walking away." He turned back to the controls, his expression darkening. If the Crith wanted to hunt them, he'd make them regret it. The only question now was, where could they go where the Crith couldn't follow? And more importantly, who could help them? As the Odyssey continued drifting through hyperspace, Ethan knew one thing for certain. This was only the beginning, the final stand. The Odyssey drifted in the silence of hyperspace, its engines humming softly as it carved a path through the swirling blue vortex. Inside the cockpit, Ethan leaned back in his seat, his fingers drumming against the console as he stared at the endless expanse ahead. For the first time since HFY, they had a moment to breathe. But the weight of what Selah had just revealed settled like lead in his chest. She wasn't just a lost child. She was the last heir of the Nixian Empire, the key to a war the galaxy had long forgotten. And Ethan had just made an enemy of the Crith Dominion, one of the most ruthless empires in existence. He let out a long breath, turning to Selah, who sat quietly in the co-pilot's seat, her silver eyes locked on the swirling lights of hyperspace. "All right, kid," he said, his voice steady. "We need a plan." Selah nodded but didn't speak. Ethan studied her carefully. She still looked pale and weak, the restraints on her wrists and ankles glowing faintly, draining her strength. "First things first," Ethan muttered. "We need to get those off you." Selah's fingers tightened around her cuffs. "They're bound to my energy," she said, her voice whispering inside his mind. "Only someone with high-level access can remove them." Ethan frowned. "And I'm guessing you don't have any friends who fit that description." She shook her head. "Of course not." Ethan rubbed his temples. The Crith weren't just after Selah. They needed her, which meant they would never stop hunting her. And that meant one thing. They had to strike first. A desperate gamble. Ethan's fingers flew over the controls, pulling up a list of potential allies. Most of them dead, in prison, or worse. One name stood out. Captain Riker, a former Nixian sympathizer and ex-commander of the Shadow Fleet, an outlaw band that once fought against the Krith Dominion. If anyone could help them, it was him. Ethan glanced at Selah. Ever heard of Riker? Her eyes widened slightly. My father trusted him once, before the war. That was good enough for Ethan. Then let's hope he's still around. With a quick sequence of commands, he altered course. A lawless outpost where ghosts of the past still lingered. Dakar 7, a graveyard of rebels. The Odyssey dropped out of hyperspace, emerging above a dark, barren planet. Was nothing more than a graveyard of ships, a floating junkyard of forgotten battles. The remains of destroyed cruisers and shattered space stations drifted like corpses, remnants of the war the galaxy had tried to erase. Ethan guided the ship through the debris field, his hand steady on the controls. Keep an eye out, he muttered. If Riker's alive, he won't trust us right away. Selah nodded, her fingers curling against her restraints. Minutes passed in silence. Then, a warning beep. Ethan's heart skipped a beat. A ship was tracking them. Before he could react, the comms crackled to life. Identify yourself, or you will be destroyed. A deep, gravelly voice. Unmistakable. Riker. Ethan grinned. Good to hear your voice, Captain. It's been a while. A long pause. Then, Cole. Ethan smirked. Told you I'd drop by someday. Another pause. Then, a sigh. Dock at Hangar 12. Riker ordered. You've got 2 minutes before I change my mind. Ethan wasted no time. He guided the Odyssey toward a hidden docking bay buried deep within the wreckage. The moment the landing gear touched down, the ship hissed as the pressurized seal engaged. Outside, a squad of heavily armed fighters stood waiting. And at the center, Captain Riker himself. A tall, broad-shouldered man with streaks of gray in his dark hair, his cybernetic eye glowing red as he studied Ethan with a mixture of curiosity and irritation. You've got a hell of a nerve showing up here, Cole, Riker said, crossing his arms. Last time I checked, you weren't in the business of making enemies with the Krith. Ethan stepped forward, motioning toward Selah. Yeah, well, plans changed. Riker's gaze shifted to Selah. And for the first time, his expression hardened. You brought me a Nixian, he muttered. Damn fool. You have any idea what kind of death sentence that is? Selah's silver eyes met his. You knew my father, she said softly, her voice reverberating in his mind. Riker flinched. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, finally, he nodded. I did. Ethan crossed his arms. So, you helping us or not? Riker exhaled. Inside. Now, the final stand begins. Inside Riker's hideout, a dimly lit command center filled with holographic maps and old war schematics, the former rebel studied Selah carefully. The Krith won't stop until they have you, he said. And if they find out you're alive, they'll burn every system in their path to get you. Ethan scoffed. Yeah, figured that out already. Riker tapped a control panel, pulling up a star chart. There's only one place that might be safe, he muttered. The dead zone. Krith ships don't go there. Ethan frowned. Because it's a death trap. Riker turned to Selah. If we go there, we'll need more than luck. We'll need you at full strength. He pointed at her glowing restraints. And that means breaking those. Selah swallowed hard. Ethan exchanged a glance with her. You up for this, kid? Selah took a deep breath. Then, for the first time, she lifted her wrists and nodded. Let's do it. Riker smirked. Atta girl. The next phase of their fight had just begun. And this time, they weren't just running. They were taking the fight to the Krith. humanity's guardian. The tension inside Riker's war room was thick, the dim glow of holographic maps casting long shadows across the metal walls. Ethan stood beside Selah, watching as Captain Riker traced a path through the dead zone, a region of space so dangerous that even the Crith avoided it. "This is your best shot," Riker said, his voice low and measured. "But it's not just about running anymore. You need a way to fight back." Ethan crossed his arms. "And how do we do that?" Riker turned to Selah. "By unleashing her." Selah's silver eyes flickered with uncertainty. She still wore the glowing restraints, sapping her strength, keeping her from tapping into the true potential of her telepathic abilities. "If we break them," Selah whispered inside their minds, "I might be able to fight, but I don't know what will happen." Ethan frowned. "What do you mean?" Selah hesitated, her hands trembling slightly. "The Crith suppressed my powers for so long. I don't know if I can control them." A heavy silence settled between them. Ethan studied her carefully. This girl had been running for her life, hunted, chained, and barely surviving. And yet, here she was, still willing to fight. He smirked. "Then I guess we'll find out together." Riker sighed. "Let's not get ahead of ourselves. First, we need to break those restraints." He pulled a small case from a locked compartment and set it on the table. When he opened it, Ethan's eyes widened. Inside was a pulse disruptor, a high-frequency tool designed to disable military-grade restraints. Ethan whistled. "Didn't think these things still existed." "They don't," Riker said. "Not legally, anyway." Selah swallowed hard, glancing at Ethan. "Are you sure?" Ethan nodded. "We didn't come this far just to stop now." Selah took a deep breath, then offered her wrists. Riker activated the disruptor, and the room filled with a low, vibrating hum. The energy bands around her wrists shuddered, sparks flickering along their surface. Then, a loud crack. The restraints shattered. Selah gasped, staggering backward as an invisible force rippled through the room. The lights flickered. The walls creaked. Ethan felt a pressure inside his skull, like standing too close to an electrical storm. And in the center of it all, Selah stood unleashed. Her silver eyes burned brighter than ever, her entire body glowing with raw, unfocused energy. Riker took a step back. "Oh, hell." Ethan barely had time to react before a shockwave exploded from Selah, sending equipment flying. He lunged forward, catching her as she collapsed into his arms. Her breathing was shallow, her body trembling. But Ethan could feel it now. She was no longer weak. She was Nixian. She was powerful. And the galaxy was about to find out just how much. The battle begins. The moment Selah regained consciousness, alarms blared throughout Riker's base. Ethan tensed. They'd been found. A frantic voice came over the comms. "Crith warships just dropped out of hyperspace. They found us." Riker cursed under his breath. "Damn it. We took too long." Ethan turned to Selah. She looked pale but determined. "You good?" he asked. Selah exhaled slowly. Then, for the first time, she spoke out loud, her voice soft, yet filled with a quiet power. "Let's end this." Ethan smirked. "That's what I like to hear." The three of them rushed to the hangar, where the Odyssey was already prepped for takeoff. Outside the base, the Crith warships hovered menacingly, their weapons primed to obliterate everything. Riker's fighters scrambled, launching into the sky, but they were outnumbered 5-1. "We can't win this fight," Riker growled. "They'll tear us apart." Ethan's mind raced. They needed a way out. A distraction. Something big enough to turn the tide. Then, Selah stepped forward. She stared at the massive Crith warship, her silver eyes reflecting its looming shadow. And then, she raised her hands. A deep vibration filled the air, a soundless force that made Ethan's bones ache. The sky darkened. The Crith warships shuddered violently, their lights flickering as if something were disrupting their systems. And then one of them exploded. Ethan's eyes widened. "What the?" Selah stood at the center of it all, her hair floating as if caught in a storm, her body glowing with power. Her voice echoed, not just in their minds, but across the battlefield. "You will never take me again." Another warship ruptured, its engines failing as its systems shorted out. Panic spread through the Cryth fleet. Ethan didn't waste the opportunity. "Get to the ship now." Riker and his crew scrambled for their vessels, launching as the Cryth ships reeled from Selah's attack. Ethan grabbed Selah's hand and pulled her onto the Odyssey, slamming the cockpit controls into overdrive. "Hold on." The ship shot upward, weaving through the battlefield as Selah's power continued ripping through the Cryth fleet. They burst into open space, Riker's ships following behind. Ethan glanced at Selah. She looked drained but unbroken. "You did it, kid," he said, grinning. "You actually did it." Selah exhaled. "It's not over." Ethan's smirk faded. He knew she was right. This battle had been a warning to the Cryth, and they wouldn't stop coming. But now they had a real fight on their hands. Ethan turned back to the stars, gripping the controls. "Then let's make sure they never forget what happens when they mess with humanity." The Odyssey's engines roared, propelling them into the unknown. And for the first time, Selah wasn't running. She was fighting back. Because she wasn't just the last Nixian anymore. She was humanity's guardian. And the war was just beginning.